Hello, my name's Rob and welcome to Swift Slots. So a few weeks ago I thought about making a video on masking up, and then I thought, well, I could progress that thought to the entire spraying process, and I left it there. And then a commenter the other day actually asked me if I would share my information with the world about how I get my paint finishes the way that I do. And I thought that's actually a really good idea. So this is a video all about how I get the finishes that I do at this stage of my hobby. So the caveat, right at the top of this video, this is my way of doing it and where I am personally at in the painting process for me personally. It's by no means the only way. There are a million painters out there that can paint way better than me, and everything that I'm doing they would contradict and say do it a different way, and that's perfectly fine. This is just a video about how I'm producing the finishes that I'm getting on my car right now, and hopefully that could help somebody else who wants to up their game or at least get a finish that's comparable to mine. But as I said, we can go much further, but at the moment this is where I'm at, and everything I'm about to tell you is purely my opinion on the products that I use and how I find them to use. So the next problem, this is exactly where I see my algorithm go down. The fact that I'm going to suggest to you that really you need to be spending about £350 to £400, and I hear you all go, oh, I'm not spending that. This is the thing with a hobby, and the money you spend on your hobby, it should be a pleasure, not a bind. If you spend money on tooling that's going to progress your hobby, that's a good thing, and you should enjoy spending that money. The money that I say £400, you'll see why I say that through the video. But if you think of it as slot cars, it's only something like 5 slot cars at today's prices. That's all it really is. So if you just buy some tools and not the slot cars, it opens up a whole new option for you that you didn't have before, where you can customize your own cars, and you can actually buy that white kit and you can put that livery on it reliably that you always wanted, where you wouldn't have that option if you didn't bite the bullet, spend some money, get some nice tools in and learn the skill of the craft. So this video is aimed at people who are new to painting, or people that have been painting for a long time, see what I do and say, that's a lovely job, Rob. I wish I could do that well. And I see that a lot in my comments. And I always get a little bit sad when people say that, because you can do what I'm doing. What I'm doing is nothing special. I'm doing really basic procedures. The only difference between the finishes that I'm getting now and the finishes that I used to get, or maybe a rattle can finish, is purely the tools that I'm using and the types of paint I'm using and the technique. It's not rocket science. It's not magic. It's really easy to do, and you absolutely can do it, unless you've got a problem with your hand where you're a bit shaky and you physically can't actually hold the air gun nicely. That's a problem that I can't help you with. But as long as you don't have problems like that, you can absolutely do what I'm doing right now very easily. And in this video, I want to show you exactly how to do that. So as I said, this is not the only way to do it. There are millions of different ways to paint a model, and my way is not the only way, and the products that I'm going to use are not the only products, but it's what I'm using now, and it's what I'm using to get the finishes that I'm getting right now. And if you copy exactly what I do, in theory, you should get exactly the same finishes as what I'm getting. So the things I want to talk about in this video are masking tape, masking, air compressors, airbrushes, paint, drying boxes, dehydrators, spray booths, and general tips on spraying. So let's start with the first one, masking tape. There are lots of different types of masking tape out there, but the types of masking tape I use is the cheapest masking tape I can find, green frog tape for general decorators masking, Tamiya tape, and cling film. So the number one thing to keep in front of your mind at all times with masking tape of any type is always keep it as clean as possible, and that includes the sides more than anything. Is keep the sides of the masking tape perfectly clean, whether that means keeping it in a bag or a Tupperware box or something like that. But absolutely never put your masking tape down onto a bare work surface, because it will pick up muck and grime on the edge of the tape, which will then transfer to your model. And don't forget, the edge of your masking tape is the edge that your paint will follow. So if there's muck and crud on the edge of the masking tape, you will get a mucky and cruddy and uneven finish along the edge of your paint line. And considering masking tape is all about sharp edges and sharp lines, the last thing you want to do is ruin that. The other thing to consider about masking tape is never let it get damp. Always keep it in an airtight box and keep it sealed out of the way of damp. Damp will kill masking tape, and certainly the cheap tape, it ruins the gum and you have a hell of a time getting the masking tape off the roll. The cheapest tape I use can be bought for any money at all, from 50p to £1, whatever. And what I use that for is masking that is not important in any way, shape or form, not important. It's for holding bits of cling film back or holding bits of paper back or just generally pulling things together, bulk masking. I never use it on the surface of a model. I never risk the cheap gum on the cheap masking tape onto paint, always onto cling film or something else. The other thing to consider about cheap masking tape is it can be highly inconsistent. You can get one type of tape that's fantastic and another type of tape that's just hopeless, and it'll only stick on paper, sometimes not even that. So that's another thing to consider with cheap masking tape, is how inconsistent it is. And when you're spraying and you want a good finish, the finish you want is always a consistently good finish. So if you're using inconsistent products, then you're asking for an inconsistent finish. So always keep in mind that cheap masking tape is highly inconsistent. The next thing I use is cling film. Now this is extremely useful for volume masking that can be used up against the paintwork without actually sticking to the paintwork. So you can cover great surfaces without actually having to stick anything to the paint. It makes a really good bulk covering material that spray paint cannot penetrate. I do not ever use paper as a mask. I've had problems in the past where the lacquer thinners or the thinners can soak through the newspaper or paper, whatever you're using, and it will actually go onto the paint beneath it, sometimes like a fog or whatever. It's just not a good thing to use. Proper automotive masking paper might be okay, but newspapers and so on, absolutely no, don't use that at all. So the next masking tape I use is frog tape. Now frog tape is a very high quality, very consistent decorators masking tape that is available from, in the UK at least, from places like B&Q and Toolstation and Screwfix. I find it to be incredibly consistent. It's not the cheapest, but it comes in a very nice plastic box which keeps the tape very, very clean. You've just got to remember to keep it in the box and don't leave it on surfaces, because like all masking tapes, you'll pick up muck. So you can get it all sorts of widths, and I use that as my secondary line of masking, and that can be used on the surface of a model. It doesn't seem to affect it at all. So you can pick up a piece of cling film and put half the cling film on the frog tape and the other half of the frog tape on the Tamiya tape, which is forming your primary masking line. And it makes a very, very good transition between the Tamiya tape and the cling film. And then my number one primary masking tape is Tamiya tape. Now I know Tamiya tape is expensive, but trust me when I tell you it is the best modelling masking tape, bar none. I don't think you'll find anybody in the modelling world that would disagree with that statement. It is a fantastic and consistent masking tape with a very sharp, very, very good edge. So what you can do with Tamiya tape is actually lay a piece of Tamiya tape down on a nice clean surface and put your steel rule on it, and then with a very sharp scalpel cut off very, very thin slithers so that you can actually mask around really tight bends. And once you've got that really tight bend masked, you can then bulk up that masking with other layers of Tamiya tape to fill out the space, and then put on your frog tape with a little bit of cling film to bulk out the rest of what you're masking. But Tamiya tape is an incredibly good modelling masking tape. You can buy it in all sorts of widths, and it comes as two different types. One in a plastic container, which is how you would buy it originally, and then once you've used it up, you can buy the refills for the plastic container. Then those plastic containers have got little serrated teeth on the edge, so it makes it incredibly easy to rip off a piece of masking tape and use the tape. Tamiya tape is just the best. It's not the cheapest, but it's absolutely the best. I went for years without using Tamiya tape because I wouldn't pay the money. And the second I started using Tamiya tape, my modelling turned a corner. It really is that good, and there are no other alternatives in my opinion. So, not really masking tape per se, but certainly a way to put masking tape on are toothpicks. I use toothpicks all of the time for my masking. And the way I do it is I cut the toothpick into a chisel edge with a sharp scalpel. The point of a toothpick is absolutely no good for putting on masking tape. What you want to do is you want to chop it off with a nice sharp scalpel and use that nice flat chisel edge of the toothpick to use as a multi-tool. You can use the flat of it to flat out the masking tape generally. You can use the side of it to get into a 90-degree recess and force the masking tape tight into the corner. And you can use the tip of it to get right down into door jambs and force the masking tape right down into the deepest grooves to make sure that that tape is well and truly set into a door jamb or a louver or any sort of body contour at all. It's not enough to just put the masking tape straight over the top of a door jamb and just spray it. That is not good enough. You need to get the masking tape to follow every single contour of the model, and that does include going down all three sides of a square recess. So the door jamb, you come down one side, you go across the bottom, and then you come up the other side. And always keep the one side of the masking tape fully relaxed so that when you're chasing that glue line on the masking tape, you allow the excess tape on the side that's not yet stuck down to the model to actually be always relaxed, so that the masking tape is using as much as it can possibly use as you're following along the model, masking it up. So don't just sort of whack it across the model and then force it down into all the contours and expect the masking tape to A, stay there, or B, keep the paint from creeping underneath it. It won't. The masking tape can only mask when it's actually in contact with the model and in contact well. And running along with the toothpick using the different sides of the toothpick that you've shaved off enforces all of the masking tape down onto all the paintwork, and then be extremely fussy with that. It is very, very important. The other thing to consider about masking up is how long it takes. It doesn't matter if it takes you 5 minutes or half an hour to mask off one window, because if you get the masking wrong, it's going to make an absolute mess of the paint that you've put on previously, because it's going to creep and all sorts of other problems. Plus also, if you get the masking wrong, the model is going to be wrong forever. So spend as long as it takes to get that masking line perfect. And don't be scared to pull the masking tape off after 20 minutes of fighting with a piece of masking tape. If it's not going well, take it off, have a cup of tea, and come back and start all over again. The model is going to be a very long time wrong if you get the masking wrong. The other thing to consider when you're masking up is use good magnification. Now, I'm in my 50s now and my eyes are turning a corner, and I've only just started using magnification in the last 5 years or so, and I do find it incredibly helpful these days. However, when I was younger, I wonder if my 20 times loop would still have been very, very useful to me, because it can see things that my ordinary eye can't see, and I doubt my eye could have seen when I was in my 30s either. So I've got a 20 times loop, and study your work incredibly carefully. You can't look at the masking enough. The closer you can see your masking, the better, and you'll be shocked at how bad your masking actually is when you look at it under a 20 times loop. And if you can see it well under a 20 times loop, it'll look fantastic to your naked eye. And I also use a set of magnifiers that you wear as a headband with 5 or 6 different types of lenses on that modelling headband. And I find that really, really good for general overall focusing on the model and getting a little bit closer than your natural eye would go to. And that also helps in masking as well for the larger masking jobs. And when you've finished and you think you're done, go over it with a 20 times loop and look at it carefully through that. Go over with your toothpick and make sure that every single fraction of that masking tape is pushed down to the model, and there's nothing that looks bad through a 20 times loop. If it looks good through a 20 times loop, it'll look fantastic to your natural eye. So, moving on to compressors. Canned air. Don't even bother. Very expensive, very wasteful, terrible for the environment. Why on earth would you want to put ordinary air into a can? It's just a pointless waste of time. Don't even consider it. What you could consider if you're on a major budget is a car inner tube and a foot pump. When I started my spraying donkeys years ago, I literally had a car inner tube and a double cylinder foot pump, and I modified a Schrader valve to put onto my airbrush and just use that. I pumped it up, and because the inner tube isn't actually in a tyre, the air pressure inside the inner tube never really gets much above 30 psi. So there's such a volume of air there to work with. It's actually quite practical, and only starts to get a little bit dodgy when you get right down to an almost flat inner tube, and then you just pump it up again. It works really, really well. It's a little bit crude, it looks a bit mad, but it does actually work. But my advice to you is, don't pump it up between spray jobs, because what you'll find is your heart rate will go up because you're pumping the pump, and then your hand will become unsteady and so on. So pump it up, get it really nice and fat, and then do the coat you need to do, and then come back to it when you finish the job to pump it up, not between jobs. It's a little bit crude, but it does do the job. So the obvious choice for a compressor for an airbrush is obviously an airbrush compressor, and you can also use a small workshop compressor, and both compressors are perfectly viable. I have got a small workshop compressor because I'm working in a workshop, and to bring my air compressor into the house would be utterly unpractical because of the noise. But if you're in a shed, then you can use a workshop compressor, and they would probably be best. For the same amount of money that you could buy a proper airbrush compressor, you would get a much bigger compressor with a much bigger volume of air, and they're just more robust, generally speaking. But if you're indoors, then the only thing you will be able to have really is a proper airbrush compressor. So that's obviously very, very quiet, very, very small, and they can range from £65 to £200, or way more than that even, but £200 maximum is all you'd need to spend for a nice indoor one. But if you buy a proper workshop compressor, maybe you could have it outside in the garden, in the shed where you keep your lawnmower, and you could have an air line running in from there into the house, in which case you've got a nice big cheap compressor, and the noise isn't really going to bother you, and you've got the advantage of having the great big cylinder of air ready to go. That's a little bit impractical for some people, but it would be an option. So either way, it depends on whether you're working in a workshop or whether you're working in the house, depends on what type of compressor. But I say, if you're working in a shed or in your workshop or somewhere away from anybody else, I would just go for a standard sort of £100 small workshop compressor. That'll be ideal. If you're working indoors, then you'll have to get a small airbrush compressor of whatever your budget suits, but they range from £65 upwards. So the next topic are airbrushes. Now my personal airbrush is an Iwata SBS Eclipse side feed. I bought it about 8 years ago, and it cost me about £130, and I absolutely love it. For me personally, it's the ideal spray gun. But my advice to you would be to buy a quality airbrush. Now you may be able to find a £20 airbrush on Amazon or eBay, and it might spray okay. But the things to consider with cheap airbrushes is, can you get a good finish with it? Does it come apart nicely? Does it go back together again nicely? Does it clean well? And if you break it, can you buy spares for it? Now, the answer to all those questions may be yes, it's fantastic. My £20 airbrush does everything fantastically well. Great. So the next question is, how long would it last? Who knows? My personal advice would be to spend anywhere between £100 and £150 on any one of the many high quality airbrushes that are out there. The other thing to consider is, if you buy a cheap airbrush for £20 and the gun doesn't perform the way you want it to, or you give up with spraying, that £20 airbrush is worth nothing. Whereas if you buy a high quality airbrush for say £130, it's easily resaleable, and you may well find that you'll get about £110 back. So you only lose about £20, which is the same £20 that you would have lost if you bought a cheap one. So why try and fight with one arm behind your back with a cheap gun? You may as well buy a high quality gun, decide you don't want to spray, sell it, lose the same amount of money as if you had done if you'd have bought a cheap brush. But the thing is, if you give up airbrushing, the chances are you're going to give up because you bought a cheap brush and it's not giving you the results that you want.
Whereas if you actually bought a high quality paintbrush, the chances are you might stick with it, because the high quality airbrush will give you a high quality finish, and that will encourage you to keep going. So you may actually find that buying a cheap brush actually takes you out of spraying completely, because you're not getting the finish you want. So you may as well just buy a high quality brush to start with. It'll spray better, you'll buy spares for it forever, you'll enjoy using it, it'll feel nicer, and it'll last a lot longer. A higher quality gun will give you a higher quality finish. Not to say a cheap gun won't to start with, but how long will it for going forwards? So my advice to you would be to look for a gun between £100 and £150, and you want to get a good brand, something like Iwata, Harder & Steenbeck, Badger, Mr. Hobby, Sparmax, Pache, brands like that. So once you've chosen your airbrush, learn to strip it down and rebuild it. Really, really important, because you'll be doing that a lot. Between colours, you'll have to strip it down, clean it out and rebuild it. Now this sounds like a chore, but it really isn't. All you need is 2 pots of thinners, or the relevant thinner that was relevant to your paint. So if you're spraying acrylics, water might be okay. If you're spraying lacquer finishes, then you'll need some thinners, and so on. So learn to strip it down and rebuild it and get comfortable with doing that. A high quality airbrush comes down and builds back up again super easy, and that's one of the benefits of getting a high quality gun, is how easy they strip, clean and rebuild. The other thing to get with a high quality airbrush, or any airbrush really, but we're talking about better quality ones, is get the proper tools to clean it with, the proper bristle brushes and so on. It doesn't have to be the exact maker's type, because they tend to be quite expensive, but just get the proper sized brushes. The little dental picks that you can get for cleaning between your teeth with the little bristles on them, they're very good, but just make sure you buy some quality cleaning tools to clean the gun with. The other thing to do with regards buying a gun, in fact, or even once you've got your gun, is to watch as many YouTube videos as you can on the gun that you've actually got. Don't bother with other guns, because they may be relevant in some areas, but other areas they won't be, and you'll be wasting your time on those other areas. So with the gun that you've chosen, go onto YouTube and watch as many videos as you possibly can bear to stomach, and possibly even some more. Because one video will cover one area really well, and another video will cover another area really well. But if you watch all of the videos, then you should get a pretty good overall idea of how your gun works and how your gun can strip down and clean and so on and so forth. So the other thing to consider when buying an airbrush is the way the gun feeds the paint. There are basically 3 different types. You've got the gravity feed with the cup on the top, you've got the side feed, and you've got the bottom feed. The bottom feed is the one that I would say don't buy. The reason why is because it will not spray very tiny amounts of paint, because there's a cup on the bottom with a tube that goes to the bottom of the cup, and you can never get the last bit of paint out. It's impossible, because the tube never touches the bottom of the jar quite right, and also when you get low on paint, as you tip the gun from side to side, you can be sucking up air, which will give you inconsistent finishes. The other problem with a top feed gun, in my opinion, is you can't have a huge volume of paint ready to go. The cup usually is about 7mm in volume, and that doesn't always supply enough paint. So if you've got a large 24th scale car, or 18th scale even, and you want a large amount of primer, for example, or a large base coat, you're only limited to 7ml of paint, or whatever cup size you've got. Plus also, when you fill that cup right to the very top and you start moving the gun around, there's a chance that you could spill the paint out the top of the cup in the early stages of painting when that cup is really full. So my gun is a side feed gun, which is the best of all worlds. The paint sits in the bottom of the cup, and the cup has got a feed on the bottom of the cup, so every last drop comes out. Plus, if I want large volumes, I can have a great big bottle feed on the side of it with the tube, like I said before. But because it's such a large amount of paint, it doesn't matter. And then I can actually fit on tiny little cups onto the side of it, where I can literally put 2 or 3 drips of paint on, where I can spray just a couple of drips of paint on a helmet or something like that. Tiny amounts of paint. So in my opinion, the side feed is the best, I find personally. Unfortunately, there are not many side feed guns left these days, and I think that idea has fallen out of favour with most people. People either go for the volume guns or for the top feed guns for artwork and so on. The bit in the middle, the grey bit in the middle where I like to live, they tend to be less common these days, but you can still buy a side feed version of my SPS Iwata. Unfortunately, it's about £100 more than I paid. It's about £230 these days, but it is an option. The other thing to consider with an airbrush is you're going to need an air line, and depending on the compressor, you're going to want a water trap, and you're also going to want a quick fitting, and I would absolutely get a quick fitting. I sprayed with my airbrush for 8 years or so without a quick fitting, and when I had the quick fitting on it, it was an absolute life changer. Being able to twist the gun in the hand without having to fight against the cable, and being able to undo the air gun to change between colours to wash the gun out without having to undo the airline all the way up the compressor end and have to recharge the whole airline, it was fantastic. You just undo it and it holds the air, and you can swivel the gun when it's all together, and it's an absolute game changer. Airlines you don't need to spend too much money with. I would go for one that's a 3 metre long one, gives you the most amount of flexibility, and also you don't need to spend huge money on them. A £5 or £10 airline, get the braided one, don't bother with the unbraided one. That will see you perfectly well. The next thing to consider is paint. Now, use good paint. That is the number one tip that I can give you. And generally speaking, stinky paints, in my opinion, tend to be the best. So paints that are based on lacquer finishes or sort of chemical paints. Now, a lot of people have a lot of success with acrylics, and that's great. But in my experience, stinky paints tend to be the best. And the stinky paint that I like to go for is the Mr. Colour paints. I've just discovered the Mr. Colour range of paints, and I find them fantastic for spraying. They're very strong pigments, so you don't need to bladder paint on. They lay down extremely well, and the colour is very strong, and you can get a real good depth of colour without having to put on really thick layers of paint. You've seen me in the video spraying with my air gun, and I never use more than 3 or 4 coats of paint. That's on a large body, but something like a motor, something like a little helmet or something like that. 2 or 3 very light coats is all you need, and that's the key, light coats. You don't want to be building up paint thicker than you absolutely need to, and that's where the Mr. Colour comes in. I find that it goes down extremely well, so you really don't need very much paint at all, and then none of the detail is lost. Also, I find with stinky paints that use thinners, as it evaporates, the paint pulls tight, so the detail doesn't get lost. So A, you're not putting as much paint on. That obviously makes the paint last longer, and as the paint dries, it pulls tight, it flattens out over the course of a few days, and the detail is nice and sharp without having to have great big thick loads of paint. The other problem, obviously, if you're using a spray can, for example, that's the problem. You can't atomize the paint small enough, therefore you have to put more paint on. When the paint goes on, it goes on a bit globby, and that's where a lot of people tend to lose a lot of detail with the rattle cans, and you can't actually get into the corners because the pressure of the can is so high. The air pressure blows the paint out of the corner, so therefore you've got to put more paint in there, so you're building up paint around the edges, and that's a no-no. So there's another reason to use high quality paints with really strong pigments through a really good quality airbrush. It atomizes the paint much better. You can run the paint at a lower pressure so you can get into corners better. You can adjust the amount of paint flowing out the gun. So if you've got a particularly tricky area that you want to use hardly any paint but a little bit of air, so you can gently lay the paint down, you can do that. And when you've got big open surfaces, you can open up the gun and spray it. Those are things that you can't do with a rattle can, and certainly things that are a challenge with paint that doesn't necessarily go nicely through an airbrush. But a good quality paint will be very, very flexible in the way that you can lay it down onto the model. The other thing to consider with your paints is your paint is a tool as well, and the paint is the thing that you're going to be looking at forevermore, because that's what we're putting down on our model is the paint. So to that end, keep your pots clean. Keep all the rims of your pots clean and use the correct thinners for the paint that you've chosen. It's really important to keep your paints nice and clean, so don't go for that jar of paint that's 15 years old, that's all crummy around the top and all the bits of the paint are flaking off into the paint. We've all been there. Don't use it. Just bung it in the bin. They're only about £2 a pot. It's not worth your time. If one of those bits of crap get into your paintwork, you've ruined your paintwork or made your life a lot difficult than it needs to be. So keep your paints clean. Keep the lids of the paints clean. Keep the rims of the jars nice and clean, and use the correct thinners. If you want a good, reliable paint that's easy to get, my advice to you would be go with Tamiya. There are hobby crafts all over the UK that stock the full range of Tamiya paints and the thinners to go with it. The little Tamiya jars of paint are excellent paints. So the X is for gloss and the XF is the matte. And they're about £2.50 a jar. They're extremely good paints and they're extremely consistent and they're very, very easy to get. And buy the correct Tamiya thinners to go with it as well. It's not expensive, then they're excellent quality paints. And those are what I was using for quite a long time. Then I discovered Mr. Colour, which now happens to be my favourite type of paint. And you can buy them from Jadlam for £2 a pot. And it's all postage free from Jadlam as well. Don't buy the eBay ones because Jadlam will charge you for the postage through eBay. And if you add 2 or 3 or 4 pots of paint, they'll add on the same amount of postage each time. So you end up paying a lot of money for postage. So just go to their website directly and buy it from them directly, and it's postage free. And what I do, I go to a shop called Kickertech, and I go through there and I choose my colours from their particular web shop because they've got a fantastic list of the paints and they list the paints extremely well. You can see exactly what you're buying and the number. And then I take that list and then I go to Jadlam and buy it. And the reason I don't go to Kickertech and buy them directly from them is because they charge postage. Simple as that. But I find the Mr. Colour paints extremely fast drying. They're very hard, really strong pigments. They're made for airbrushes and they cover extremely well with a very, very thin coat. So this is why I prefer the Mr. Colour paints. And also the top coat that I actually use is the Mr. Colour 112 UV Cut. And that is fantastic top coat. It's not the best top coat. I think possibly the best top coats nowadays are the 2K kits that you can buy that comes with the hardener and the lacquer and a tub of thinners. But the trouble is they're about £20 a kit. Probably do you 10 cars, but £18 to £20 for a kit is a little bit strong for me at the moment. I've never actually tried it, but I will be getting on to 2K finishes at some point, I'm sure. And the 2K finishes are supposed to be safe with transfers as well. But so is the UV cut. I haven't had a problem with transfers with UV cut yet. So there's something to consider there. So the next thing is spray booths. So my advice to you would be to go and buy one. They're about £95 for the cheapest spray booth on eBay. They're all pretty much the same. They're all generic types, or more or less. And if you pay more, I don't know if you're actually getting more. But what you'll get for £100 is a nice strong fan, replaceable filters, full lighting, and a nice big open surface that you can catch all the paint in and spray. So the booth mouth is quite large. They're very, very good. I made my own spray booth, as you've seen in historical videos, and it took me a whole day to make and cost me about £40. Yes, it's a decent sized booth. Yes, it's pretty strong. But to be fair, it was a day's worth of work and 40 quid. And I think, to be honest with you, you could probably just go and buy one and get exactly the same job with a lot less hassle. But if you feel like making one, you absolutely can. You could probably get a much bigger booth for less money. But like I say, it's time versus money where your priorities lie. But you can buy any old spray booth really off of eBay, £95, job done, moving on. Don't underestimate a spray booth. Don't be tempted to spray your model out of the workshop door. It's not a good thing. You absolutely do need a spray booth if you want a decent finish and in a controlled environment. So you got to the point where your paint is on your model and it's just come out of the spray booth all nice and shiny and wet and looking fantastic. What you'll need to do then is instantly stick it underneath a Tupperware box or some sort of area where it's dust free, not a cardboard box. Cardboard has got lots of fibres on it and they can fall off and fall onto your model. Stick it underneath a nice clean Tupperware box or plastic storage container where the paint can sit there wet for about half an hour and soak into the other previous colours or sink into the plastic and form a nice dry skin over the top. Once it's got that nice dry skin and it's effectively dust resistant, you can then put it into a dehydrator if you want to. Now, I found a dehydrator works extremely well. It doesn't actually dry the paint hard so that it's as hard as it ever will be within 24 hours. What I find the dehydrator will do, it'll speed up the drying process and you can remask onto the top of a freshly painted surface, really hard masking, after 2 days, which might normally have taken 3, 4, 5 days to do. But a dehydrator will give you a really good surface to work on after about 24 hours. But to be honest with you, I would wait 48 hours to do really heavy masking. But after 1 day, you can certainly handle the work without being too rough with it, whereas times would be longer if you didn't use a dehydrator. But you definitely don't put it in a dehydrator straight away. You'll see some people telling you that you can spray the model and stick it straight into the dehydrator, and you can, physically you can do that. But the disadvantage of that is you're not allowing the paint to bite into the existing layers and settle down nicely. So if you stick it straight into a dehydrator, you're flash drying it and it won't have a chance to bond tight. So give it half an hour underneath your plastic tub and then move it to the dehydrator and let the dehydrator do the rest of the work. If you don't have a dehydrator, no problems at all. Just leave the model for a day or two between coats. Well, a day or 2 or 3 days really between coats. But a dehydrator is certainly the way to go. If you do decide to put your model in dehydrator, put it to the lowest setting and just run it for 3 or 4 hours. I don't think there's much need to do it longer than that, but definitely the lowest setting, because much more than the lowest setting on most dehydrators, and you could have a chance of warping the plastic. So to finish off, the number one thing for spraying, the number one thing above all else, is clean and tidy. Be fussy about your work environment. Don't do it in a dusty area. Don't do it in a dirty area. Everything should be clean. Don't use dirty second-hand rags on things that are important. Don't use dirty, nasty paintbrushes. Don't use anything dirty and nasty. Be absolutely meticulous on cleanliness. Cleanliness is the number one thing for any sort of painting at all. You can't be too fussy and too clean when it comes to paint. And when you're standing in front of your spray booth and you're painting, see if you can wear a plastic top, something, even a bin bag with 2 holes in it where your arms come out would be a good idea. And the reason why is because as the spray booth is sucking in air, it's also sucking in little bits of fluff off your clothes. So if you can cover up your clothes with a plastic tunic or something similar to that, you're stopping a lot of the fibres that are on your clothes being sucked into the booth and inevitably right on the bonnet of your freshly painted car. So try and use a plastic tunic if you can. The other golden rule to all painting is leave it the hell alone. Don't fiddle with it once it's had a coat of paint on it. We're all guilty of it. I am very guilty of it. When you put a coat of paint on it, leave it alone. Put it straight into that tub where it can sit there resting, and then after half an hour, if you've got a dehydrator, put it in the dehydrator, set it to the lowest setting and let it run for a few hours and leave it in there for 24 hours minimum. Each coat of paint that you put on your car or your model, unless if you're putting coat on top of coat, then you can put it on after an hour. That's fine. But if you're going to start masking off and so on and so forth, give every coat at least a day, if not 2. That's the number one tip as well. That's really, really important. So many of us just go in there, think, oh, it's dry, and it's not dry, and we ruin it. And that's a big problem. The other thing is don't mix your paints as well. Stick with one brand, because then you won't have problems with wrinkling and so on and so forth. The other thing to think of is when you're putting on different layers of paint, say all the same colour obviously, give it about 15 minutes between coats. Most modern paints will be roughly dry within 15 minutes. I know acrylics are, Mr. Colour goes dry within 15 minutes, and also Tamiya. All of those 3 brands there, the types of paints, they'll all be dry enough to recoat after 15 minutes. So don't be tempted to whack a coat on and then 1 minute later whack another coat on. That's just not a long enough time. About 15 minutes between coats is absolutely fine, and you'll be good to go on that. Again, that's all down to leaving it alone and don't rush it. It's just having a bit of self-control to just leave it where it is and then just put on the next coat of paint when it's ready to.
So that's that. That's everything that I can think of to tell you at this particular point in time. If there's any other things that I think of, I can do a follow-up video, and for sure Ask me anything you want to ask me in the comments below. If I haven't covered anything or you're unclear about something that I've said, just ask in the comments below and I'll do my best to answer it for you. If I could just ask one small favour before I end this video, if there's anything that I've said during this video that you vehemently disagree with, either leave me a helpful comment below or just walk on by. Don't fill my chat comments up with nasty comments because it's just not warranted or very helpful. So there we are. I hope that you found this video helpful and it will help people in the months and years to come to elevate their paintwork if they're not quite happy with it at the moment. I'd love to see some comments below with people telling me that they've done what I've suggested and they're really happy with the finishes that they're getting. That would be fantastic. So, if you've enjoyed this content, maybe you'll subscribe, and if you hit the little bell button, that'd be awesome. So until the next time, thank you very much.